Hello, this is Charming Quarks, a scientific podcast. My name is Caroline, and I'll be looking top down and bottom up at some strangely interesting yet charmingly beautiful scientific discoveries. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this scientific soundbite. This week we will sink to new scientific depths as we continue to follow the adventures of the Swiss scientist and explorer Auguste Piccard. Born in 1884, Auguste Piccard combined his formal training in both science and engineering to lead a life of amazing discovery. His scientific achievements cut across the technical disciplines of physics, chemistry and biology. But more than that, his personal bravery and engineering feats allowed us to reach both new heights and new depths. In this podcast, I'm going to take a look at his final adventure, which saw Piccard sink to the ocean floor. Having already designed a gondola that hung under a balloon and allowed Piccard to float up to an altitude of 10 miles above the Earth's surface, he realised that he might be able to use similar technology to reach the ocean bed. So, in 1937, he and his scientific team set off to design a boat that could withstand the pressures that might be experienced on the ocean floor. When you are literally going into uncharted waters, it's always a good idea to have a look around and see what others have achieved. And for Piccard, the nearest comparison was Beebe and Barton and their 1932 Bathyscaphe. A bathysphere literally translates as deep sphere, and in the case of Beebe and Barton, it was a 2-metre diameter sphere that allowed them to dangle on a winch and a rope underneath a boat. On August the 15th in 1934, Beebe and Barton in their bathysphere contraption hung underneath the boat. They were slowly winched down to a depth of about half a mile below the ocean surface. On board they had both oxygen cylinders and soda lime. The latter helped to absorb the carbon dioxide that they exhaled. They hung by a single 2.2 centimetre diameter cable, and within that cable there was radio comms allowing them to communicate back up to the boat. It was also that single cable which allowed them to be winched back up to the ocean surface. And for Piccard, it was that single cable that was the problem. If for any reason that cable should have failed, there was only one way that Beebe and Barton would have gone, and that would have been down to surely a watery grave on the ocean floor. Thankfully, it never happened, and Beebe and Barton were two truly brave adventurers. However, for Piccard, if you were going to sink, you had to make sure that you could get back up again, and for him, relying on a sole cable wasn't going to be enough, so he set about designing a new type of sinking boat. Piccard originally secured European funding to build his boat. However, when the Second World War began, the work had to be put to one side. Following the war, he picked it up again, but this time backed by United States funding, and he went about building the first ever Bathyscaphe, this time not a deep sphere, but a deep boat. Like both his gondola for the balloon and the work of Beebe and Barton, Piccard designed his sphere to accommodate 2 grown men. It was a 2.16 metre diameter sphere. However, unlike the balloon gondola, which was made of thin aluminium, in this instance Piccard used 5-inch thick steel. He had to in order to protect against the immense pressure that would be experienced at the bottom of the ocean bed. Piccard's eventual goal was going to be able to sink to a depth of 6 miles, and when you go that low into a water volume, you have immense pressure put upon you. In fact, at that depth, it's like having 100 people stand on every square inch of your body. For Piccard, the engineer, he wanted to over-design, and so he built in 4-fold safety. In other words, the vessel had to be able to survive 4 times the pressure that they expected. So whilst this steel volume made for a very safe enclosure for the men, it was also very heavy, and that was a problem. How are you going to get a really heavy ball to not only sink, but also to come back to the surface? The sphere was never going to float on the surface by itself. However, it needed to allow the scientists to get on board. So Piccard and the US team actually designed a 15-metre long vessel underneath which the sphere hung. Now, to keep the vessel up at the ocean surface, they required some kind of buoyancy material. An obvious choice might have been air. However, as the boat would have sunk, the air would have begun to compress, and to prevent that from happening, you'd have had to put it in a container that had such thick walls that you would just be adding yet more weight. So the team turned to gasoline, 85,000 litres of it. And although it's a flammable material, it provided the buoyancy and, crucially, the incompressibility that was needed for this mission. So if the gasoline was the mechanism by which the sphere was going to stay afloat, then you also needed something that was going to let it both sink and then come back up to the surface. And for this, they used a combination of both water and iron pellets. By initially flooding some empty tanks with water, they could get the Bathyscaphe to begin the journey down to the ocean floor. Once there, the plan was to release 9 tons of magnetic iron pellets onto the ocean floor, and that reduction in weight would be sufficient to allow the buoyant gasoline to overtake and float the object back up to the surface. So the challenge now was how to make sure that the iron pellets actually did release, because if they didn't, the team would be stuck once again on the ocean bed. For this, they actually turned to electromagnets. These are devices that can create a magnetic field through the application of electricity. They comprise of a coil of conductive wire wrapped around a metal core. When electricity flows through the wire, it generates a magnetic field. Within the Bathyscaphe, these were used to form the latches on the containers that contain the iron pellet. With the electric field turned on, the generated magnetic field kept the latch shut and the iron pellets secure. By turning off the electricity, the magnetic field dissipated, and this meant the latch opened and the pellets dropped out. Now this had the advantage that, should for any reason a failure happen and the electricity be cut off, then the doors would automatically open and the Bathyscaphe would always float back to the surface. The system was always designed to fail safe, and safe meant floating. With the steel sphere, the gasoline, the iron pellets, the electromagnets and a number of successful test dives, the team were ready to go for the big one. They decided to try to sink to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the world's seas. Located in the Pacific Ocean, it stretches down 6.8 miles. Because no one had been there before, the team had to use sticks of DNT to send explosive shockwaves down, listening for the echo to pinpoint the exact location to try to make the dive. On the 23rd of January 1960, the team was ready to go. However, there was one final problem. Auguste Piccard himself was 76, and he concluded that was just a bit too old to make the dive in person. Fortunately, there was another Piccard that was ready to take on the rudder. Auguste's son Jacques had been involved in the build throughout, and he was more than willing to dive to the new depths. So, in 1960, it was Jacques Piccard, accompanied by the American oceanographer Don Walsh, that climbed into their Bathyscaphe, named the Trieste, and started to make their very slow descent. Crawling at the very slow descent rate of 0.9 metres per second, they disappeared into the gloom. They peered out of their small plexiglass windows, looking at the new ocean world around them. Almost just before they were due to hit the ocean bed, there was a large crack. What Jacques and Don didn't know was that one of the plexiglass windows had failed. But they made the decision that they were so close they might as well keep going. And so, based on that bravery, after 4 hours and 47 minutes, they touched the ocean bed, creating a lovely dust cloud around them. When the dust had settled, they took a look at the ocean world around them. Illuminated by quartz light bulbs, they saw small sole, flounder and squid. Surprisingly, even at these great depths, nature is able to produce biological creatures that can survive the immense pressure and cold temperatures. After a short period on the ocean floor, they released the electromagnets and the iron pellets came out. They began their ascent, and 3 hours and 14 minutes later, it was all over. Jacques and Don were the first two men to reach the Mariana Trench floor, and they did it in a beautiful bathyscaphe designed by Auguste Piccard. The Trieste Bathyscaphe is an elegant combination of both engineering and science. It was a beautiful object that allowed mankind to go to new depths and witness areas of the world not previously seen. The discovery of the fish and the flounder and the squid was significant. It prevented mankind from using the Mariana Trench as a dumping area for radioactive waste. And the feat of reaching that depth wasn't repeated until 2012. Auguste Piccard combined skill, bravery, ambition and endeavour, allowing us to look at the world in new ways. These are characteristics that run in the Piccard family. Auguste's son Jacques, Jacques' son Bertrand, but also Auguste's twin brother Jean-Félix Piccard. And this brings me to the final point of this week's podcast. For all you Star Trek fans out there, you may know a certain character, Captain Jean-Luc Picard. But did you know he was actually named after the real-life scientific twins Auguste and Jean Piccard? So Auguste made it as a scientific legend, not only in fact, but also in fiction. Well, I hope you enjoyed this dive into the ocean. Next week, we'll be back up on the surface, going into the kitchen to look at one of our household appliances. If you like what you're listening to, please do like the video and subscribe. Thanks again for listening in, and I hope you can join me for our next scientific soundbite.